You've probably heard of Billie Holiday. She was an American jazz and swing singer that performed with popular musicians like Louis Armstrong. There have been multiple movies dedicated to her life, and she still has over 3 million Spotify listeners each month. But what you may not know is that before her death in 1959, she was a symbol for the war on drugs, and specifically, the war on cannabis. Drug laws in the U.S. have been notoriously racist. Politicians spent decades trying to associate drug use with blacks and Hispanics. After the Prohibition era in the 30s, Prohibition enforcers like this guy were out of a job. Harry Anslinger was in charge of keeping rum out of the country, but once the Prohibition era ended, he shifted his focus to an easier target: cannabis. Anslinger then dedicated his career to punishing drug users, especially ones of color. He popularized the Spanish word marijuana to associate cannabis with Mexican immigrants. And his strategy worked. For years, Americans associated cannabis with immigration, poverty, and race, helping his mission to demonize the plant. He passed the Marijuana Tax Act to crack down on cannabis use, and he spread the idea that marijuana was making black folks forget their place in society. Needless to say, he was racist. So when Billie Holiday and other black jazz artists were openly smoking joints during their performances, he wasn't too happy about it. Immediately, he began to associate jazz with black musicians who used cannabis and called it satanic music. When referring to POC, he's quoted as saying, "Their satanic music, jazz and swing, result from marijuana use. This marijuana causes white women to seek sexual relations with Negroes." Yikes. Billie Holiday was having none of it and fought back with her 1939 song, Strange Fruit.
Southern trees bear strange fruit.
Strange Fruit was dangerous. It was a protest song that spoke about the brutality and violence experienced by Black Americans. The song is based on a poem by Jewish writer Abel Meeropol and describes the horrific lynchings in the South. The song was controversial because it made people question their role in society. Strange Fruit was so feared because the government knew it had the potential to start a civil rights movement. And the fact that a black woman like Billie Holiday could be so open about racism was evidence for Anslinger that cannabis made black people defiant. He was pissed. Anslinger quickly forbid Holiday from singing Strange Fruit, but knowing how powerful the song was, she continued. Amidst her activism and singing career, she was also a heroin addict and suffered from childhood trauma. Anslinger used this against her. He had her arrested, followed, and harassed by government officials for years. Though Billie Holiday persisted with performing, the constant harassment coupled with her addiction took a toll on her body. She sought medical help in the hospital, but Anslinger ordered doctors to refuse her treatment. She died just a few days later at 44 years old. Strange Fruit was considered the song of the century decades after her death. And in the meantime, the demonization of cannabis continued and launched what we now know as the war on drugs. In particular, cannabis was facing its own war, with lawmakers associating cannabis with the black community and fueling policy with racism. Harry Anslinger was hugely responsible for anti-cannabis legislation and helped make cannabis a Schedule I drug alongside heroin, marking it as a high potential for abuse drug. For context, Schedule II drugs, which are considered less severe, include opiates, PCP, and cocaine. Here's the thing. The fight for cannabis is fought alongside the fight for civil rights. Anti-cannabis laws frequently target black users over white ones, despite the drug being used at a pretty consistent rate across the board. In 2010, an ACLU report found that black people were 4 times more likely to be arrested for cannabis than white people. Not to mention, black mothers who use cannabis are heavily scrutinized despite an entire culture of self-proclaimed wine moms, primarily in white families. And even today, with the thriving legal market, black women make up such a tiny minority of the industry leaders. Harry Anslinger and other government officials spent decades trying to associate cannabis with the black community. But now that cannabis is entering legal territory, the biggest players are suddenly white. Billie Holiday was chastised for her drug use 90 years ago, Yet we still have black women like Sha'Carri Richardson being the target of anti-cannabis policy. Cannabis policies are historically linked with racism, and even though it might be less explicit, it's still ingrained in our government, our law enforcement, and the cannabis industry itself. Moving forward, we need better representation, both in government and in the cannabis industry. It's also important to spread awareness on the history to promote change. And though change may be difficult, it's certainly not impossible. And as Billie Holiday once said, "The difficult I'll do now, the impossible will take a little while."